you to do, please. First, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting here, protesting here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, land that was never ceded. We pay our respects to elders and all those that have been impacted by their lands getting confiscated by the ongoing racism and injustice in this country. Now, we are in front of the Defence Department, as you probably already know, and thanks for coming along. We are still in a time of COVID, and I wanted to ask you if you would mind making a little bit of distance between yourselves. I know we're all conscious of it. I think we just need to show others that we are conscious of it, and also that will avoid a little bit of undue harassment. I guess you know a bit about Sydney Stop the War, but if you don't, we started, well, all of us active in Stop the War were opposing the war before it began in Afghanistan. And we've been continuing to call for the troops to get out. We want the troops to be out. We want serious reparations to be made to the Afghans. And we certainly want the war criminals to face justice, including those that are ultimately responsible for what we're now learning, such as the former Prime Minister John Howard and the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. My name is Pip Hinman. Sorry I didn't introduce myself. I've been active with Stop the War Coalition for, 19 years or so. Thanks to all those that have stepped forward to help organise this STAP action. So we're here to say in front of the Defence Department that the real war criminals should be charged, and not the whistleblowers, not the journalists. The people that ordered the cover-up that this Brereton report is now uncovering, they are the ones that should be charged. We don't think it's a surprise that the ADF is now admitting to war crimes that have been committed. The surprise to us is that so few war crimes have been admitted to. And we know that there are a lot more to add to this report. The fact is, as we know in Australia, this war has been conducted in secret. Yet it was launched in our name in 2001 by John Howard. The Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has actually described this war as a good war, as distinct from the bad war in Afghanistan. So this war has continued in support of both the major parties, and that is why, really, it has continued for almost 20 years. Well, we have a few speakers here today. Some are on their way. The first speaker I'd like to introduce is Nick Reimer. Nick is here on behalf of...
I'd like also to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to thank Pip for asking me along, because she also did the same thing to me 12 years ago. In October 2008, I came to a meeting a bit like this one, and that was to mark the 7th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan. At that time, 7 years seemed a long enough time, and another 12 have elapsed. We've been in Afghanistan for 19 years. I ask you to imagine how you would feel if this country was being occupied by foreign forces for 19 years. I've got no doubt that you would be joining the resistance and the opposition to that occupation if that were the case. When I spoke 12 years ago, I remarked on how sad it is that this small number of people, like we see here, that has a true understanding of the futility of trying to resolve international disagreements through acts of warfare and violence, I say how sad it is that we have to come out onto the street and brave being labelled ratbags and radicals, when the only thing we want and need to say is that violence does not bring peace. And if ever there was an illustration of the truth of that, it is there in the Investigator General Berriton's report. Violence breeds yet more violence. It does not bring peace, yet peace is the one thing that we, in common with all other peoples, need and crave. Now, during the years that have elapsed since 2008, it became clear to me that if we are to get to grips with Australia's dark obsession with joining pointless wars in far-off countries, opposition must be organised on a national scale. That's why I'm with IPAN, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, a national organisation that hopes to encourage peace activism at every level. So in passing, may I mention that IPAN is offering a marvellous opportunity for people like you and me to give expression to our thoughts and feelings about Australia's foreign and defence policies. So IPAN's about to launch a People's Inquiry to explore the case for an independent and peaceful Australia. This inquiry will examine the costs and consequences of Australia's involvement in US-led wars and the Australia-US alliance. So it's bound to be vitally interesting to all of us who are here today, and I do urge you to seriously consider writing your own submissions to that inquiry. You can come and talk to me about it afterwards. That's not the reason I want to be here and talk to you today. So I was saying that there's sadness in the fact that so few of us have a clear understanding of international events and of the actions perpetrated in our name. And that sadness stays with me. And how deeply sad it is that those who have called out excessive violence or wrongdoing are actually facing legal prosecution for doing so. So I take the opportunity to mention David McBride, Bernard Collaery, Witness K, and of course Julian Assange. They have all blown the whistle on unacceptable behaviour, and they are all being punished through the so-called system of justice for doing so. And speaking of justice, don't overlook the fact that the invasion of Afghanistan was illegal itself from the very start. It was not sanctioned by the United Nations, and the decision to join the invasion was not even taken by the Australian Parliament. We should never have been there in the first case. The leaders who instigated should be facing the courts rather than the people who imagine that they're carrying out the wishes of those leaders, and least of all, the people who spoke up when they saw the wrongs that were being done. So today, my sadness is turning into anger. It angers me that we joined the invasion of Afghanistan, just as it angers me that we also invaded Iraq. I do not understand why we went in, and I do not understand why we cannot leave. And the anger that I feel has been expressed brilliantly and far better than I can by journalist Caitlin Johnston. So I'm going to finish by quoting her words, almost verbatim, and I do ask your indulgence for including the expletives that she also uses. So, on the 19th of November, Caitlin Johnston wrote, "If you train young people to kill, you must deliberately warp their minds so as to normalise the abnormal act of killing their fellow human beings. If you then leave them to their own devices in an unfamiliar land full of unfamiliar people over whom they hold the power of life and death, these things," meaning the atrocities that have been revealed in the Brereton report, "these things will happen, they cannot but happen. They have happened many, many times in ways we will never know about, not just at the hands of Australian forces, but of the entire occupying coalition. This is on top of the massive pile of corpses that the US power alliance has been heaping up upon Afghanistan by the Trump administration's record-shattering bombing campaigns and corresponding civilian casualties by the presidential administrations that preceded it. Afghanistan is a military occupation which we know for a fact we were deceived about from the very beginning. And we were also deceived into allowing it to continue every step of the way. Knowing that we were deceived into it, and knowing what its grave consequences are, there is no excuse for it to continue. There is no legitimacy. There is no legitimacy in babbling about power vacuums and what political system Afghanistan will have after brutalizing that nation in the way that the US power alliance has. Such arguments are like a rapist saying he can't stop raping a woman because some other rapist might come along and rape her if he does. The most depraved and murderous force in that country, that's Afghanistan, which has already been killing far more civilians than the Taliban and ISIS combined, has no business concerning itself with what will happen after it leaves. Caitlin Johnson then addresses what she's termed the US power alliance directly when she says, "Do not concern yourself with what might happen when you leave. What will happen when you leave is that you will not be there murdering human beings. There are no conditions that have to be met first. You are the violent extremists in Afghanistan doing the killing and destroying. You are the terrorists. Leave!" And she goes on. There is no more destructive force on this earth than the tight alliance of nations centralized around the United States, which on foreign policy functions as a single empire. The only beneficial thing that such a blood-soaked empire could do for the good of the world is to cease its behaviour and cease to exist. It is not the benevolent good guys staving off the bad guys. It is the bad guys, and its depravity must come to an end. And she says, get out of Afghanistan. Get the fuck out! Now! Not just Australia, but the entire murdering, occupying coalition. It's not your country, and you're making the situation worse. Get the fuck out!
SAS, USA, how many kids did you kill today? SAS, USA, how many kids did you kill today? SAS, USA, how many kids did you kill today? SAS, USA, how many kids did you kill today?
Well, some of you know the democracy.
We gathered on the Gadigal of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders past and present. This is, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Let's also recognize that there can be no social or environmental justice without racial justice, and there can be no racial justice without First Nations justice. Thank you so much all for coming together to stand together, to demand justice for those against which such horrific crimes have been committed. What happened in Afghanistan was the murder and torture of innocent people. Innocent people and children, leaving families torn apart and leaving communities in ruin. And that has been happening for the last 20 years. The heinous crimes committed by Australia are yet another shameful chapter in our history. I do want to acknowledge the courage of whistleblowers like David McBride and the journalists here and in Afghanistan who put their necks on the line, who put their lives on the line to get the truth out in the open. And they must be protected. The perpetrators of these crimes and their superiors must be held to account, and they must face the full force of the law. Justice has to be served here. All investigations must be independent and the findings made public. And there have to be fair reparations for the families and to the communities targeted by these disgusting crimes. Australian troops must be brought home. But there is clearly a much bigger problem here than just the individuals involved in this case, and the many others that have surfaced over the last few months. What we are seeing here is a culture that allowed this brutality to go on. And that culture must be investigated, it must be owned, and it must be addressed. I mean, war always has horrifying human costs. Most of all, the politicians that took us to these wars have to be held to account. I think that's one of the key things here, that the politicians who intervened in the Middle East, in those countries where communities and people have been dying and suffering for decades, have to be held to account. The post-9/11 wars on terror have raged on for many, many years. These wars have killed over 500,000 civilians in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Pakistan. Let's never forget that. Women have often been the unseen victims of these crimes and of these wars. Their rights violated, and they have been subjected to heinous gender-based violence. You know, Afghans have been forced to flee the country, and now they really are the largest refugee population in the world, all because Western nations like Australia intervened. And surely we have to admit that deploying armed forces, deploying guns, deploying bombs in the name of quashing terrorism will not protect anyone. It never has, and it never will. It has the exact opposite effect. We must stop warmongering. We must stop blindly following the US. We need to seriously reconsider the utility of the ANZUS alliance and get US troops off Australian soil. US troops being here only reinforce this false notion of a perpetual military threat and serve no real purpose other than the pursuit of US interests. Where war is concerned, history has sadly repeated itself time and again. We need to remind ourselves, and we need to remind others, that there are few failures as colossal as the incessant, self-interested attempts of Europe and the US and its allies like Australia to control and extinguish complex Middle Eastern conflicts. And let's not forget that the root cause of these conflicts stems from exactly similar Western interventions in the first place. Colonialism's legacy has cast a very long shadow indeed. It would seem that we have learned nothing from history. To challenge the culture of war, we must start by changing the terms of our national conversation. We need to point to the woeful failures of the wars that Australia has involved itself in. And we need to talk about war as it is, not an abstract geopolitical conflict between sides on a map, like in the game Risk, but in human terms, as devastating, as painful, and traumatic collective experiences of society. We need to clearly imagine what we want the world to look like on a global scale. And for me, that's about changing the conversation from going to war to peace and justice. That's what we need to do. We need to bring peace and justice. And if that's what we aim for, then our success will rest on reparations for past injustices. It will rest on fair economic, environmental, and social development, and respect for human rights, not on military capabilities. Australians have been shocked by the inhumanity of the heinous war crimes exposed by the Brereton report. So now is the time, and that's the challenge that we have. The challenge that we have now is to bring people together, to send a very strong message to our government and governments across the world. War criminals must be charged. Troops must be brought home. Reparations must be given. War is never the answer. We must stop beating the drums of war. Thank you so much for your commitment to this cause.
Against the United States bases and the connection and the close alliance that Australia has with the United States on military matters. Thank you, Denis, for coming. You have to stand a bit closer to this.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you to the organisers, and I recognise that we're standing on Aboriginal land. Always was, always will be. We're here, we know why we're here. We're here because it suddenly dawned on people, it suddenly got on the news that Australians have committed war crimes in Afghanistan. And if you look at the paper, you see the shock and horror. You see the Daily Telegraph saying, it's a dagger to the heart. And the Sydney Morning Herald has similar. They have disappointed us. They have let us down. Earlier, one of the headlines said, fueled by bloodlust, our troops are rogue. But you and I know that in every war that Australians have been in, we have committed war crimes. Breaker Morant in the Boer War committed a war crime. And now we're faced with what happened in Afghanistan. And it's the same things that we've been saying over and over again. We want to get rid of ANZUS. Howard led us into Afghanistan using ANZUS. He said we have to go to the support of the United States because of ANZUS. And he used a section of that to justify it. He also said that because of what happened in New York at 9/11, you remember that 3,000 United States citizens died in 2001, I think it was. 3,000. There's 300,000 people have died in Afghanistan. 10 times that number have died in Afghanistan. And then you multiply Iraq in and Syria and so on. There's a US commentator saying because of 2001, there are 67 million people who are refugees. 67 million people. Now, the lowest common denominator when it comes to waging war is that you must be proportional. Now, 3,000 to 67 million is not proportional. It's out of the planet. That's the sort of country that we're aligned with. And that's the second thing that we've got to fight against. The Australian-US alliance. We must get rid of it. We must be an independent country that doesn't jump to attention and go off to these terrible wars at the bequest of the United States. That's the second thing we must do. Now, we must also remember that the list of prime ministers, Howard started it, Rudd started it, Rudd called it the good war. Iraq was a bad war, Afghanistan's a good war. Then Gillard said nothing. Then Rudd said nothing again. Then Abbott wanted to increase the numbers, and so it went on. Not one of those people have ever had come on the news and apologised for sending those troops there and putting them in a situation. Not one of them has apologised or suffered any diminution of their status in Australia. Not one. And they're the people responsible. David Hurley was in charge during that war. David Hurley. You know, David Hurley is known as the much loved. I don't know who loves him, but he's called the much loved Governor of New South Wales. And because he was the much loved Governor of New South Wales, he became the much loved Governor General of Australia. And he was there. He was getting these reports, and he did nothing. He did nothing, and now look at him. He's our Governor General, the top person in our country, and he did nothing. These are the people who we must remember. We also remember the perpetrators, those poor men put in situations like that. They're just as guilty, but they're the ones who will suffer. The sergeants and the corporals and the privates. None of the top brass will suffer. And then we had for those of you who come from a socialist background, we had the ruling class is stepping in. Kerry Stokes. Kerry Stokes is financing with endless pockets the defence of one of these men. The man who got the VC. And apparently he got a VC for slitting a throat. That's what he got the VC for. Some poor shepherd boy happened to be walking by at the wrong time. And then he became on the committee that selects the Australian of the Year. That's how we idolise our military. And that's got to stop. Our military are just as good and just as bad as every other military. We are not wonderful bronze Aussies who love a beach and a good laugh and a schooner of beer. There's a deeper, darker side of us that it's the same as everybody else. And we must stop idolising our troops. We must stop having monuments all over the place. On my trip here, I passed huge monuments to our soldiers. But we know that every one of those monuments holds a dark secret. And the dark secret is that those people committed war crimes just as much as anybody else. And they're the people who brought us shame. And we must remember that. Now we have to pick ourselves up from this terrible catastrophe. And we have to say, what do we do next? Well, we have to continue that struggle that we've been on for a long time. The first one is no more Australian involvement in US wars.
Yes.
We must start doing that. The whistleblower, I was listening to a broadcast by him today. He said the only reason that we're in Afghanistan was to satisfy the Americans, because we have some weird desire, weird idea that should we get into trouble with another country, the Americans will ride in on their white horses and white hats and save us. Now that's an illusion. We are big enough and old enough and ugly enough and all the rest of it to stand on our own 2 feet. We do not need the United States. We have to reduce military spending. Reduce military spending. In the middle of a pandemic, we were sending ships to the South China Sea. We were sending ships to exercise off Hawaii. We were sending ships. We have ships presently in Malabar, exercise Malabar. Now Malabar is familiar to Sydney-siders. Exercise Malabar has got nothing to do with the sewage works at Malabar. But they have one thing in common. They're full of shit. Military exercises are full of shit. And this is what they're doing in the middle of a pandemic. And there's been a $1 billion increase in military spending. That's what, $1 billion. And our amount of spending has gone from 1.8% of GDP to 2.4%. We were only ordered to go to 2% by Trump, but we're doing 2.4%. And when the pandemic struck, we had no PPE. We had no, none of those breathalyzer things, what are they called? Those things. We had none of those because all our money was going up in smoke on F-35s, on warships, submarines. And the things that we need, they're all neglected. In Glebe at the moment, they're evicting people. Social housing, they're evicting people and turning them into luxury flats. Could you imagine that in the middle of a housing crisis? But there's never any money for social housing, but there's always money for guns. So comrades, keep up the great work you've been doing. Some of you for 30, 40 years. Some of you may be new to it, but you've still got a couple more years to go before we've got a just country. Keep up the good work. It's great to see you here, and it's great to have a demo after a pandemic. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming out here today. As people have said, we're protesting here today against the horrific war crimes committed by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan. Shame! The Brereton report only confirms past allegations of these horrific crimes. For decades, Australian soldiers, with the protection of their lawyers, with the protection of their commanders, with the protection of politicians, have been committing crimes, torturing civilians, the blooding new soldiers had to participate in, blowing up homes and villages. These particular instances have been redacted in the report, but thanks to the bravery of individual whistleblowers, of journalists, we know some of the details, just the tip of the iceberg of the murder and the horrific crimes that Australian troops perpetuated. Cases of killing at close range, cases of killing innocent, unarmed people, and consistently planting radios on these people to make their acts permissible in the eyes of the law. Shame. But we have to be clear that these crimes are not exceptions to the rule. These crimes are systematic. They are the tactics that have been used and have been confirmed from the very top. And they have been consistently hidden from the public. And they really prove that going into war in the first place was never about a humanitarian intervention, was never about helping the poor oppressed people in the Middle East. It was always about imperialism. It was all about increasing the US's hegemony. It was all about oil. And this really shows, I think, what a horrific system that we live in, where millions upon millions of people have to die for this. And I think it's an extension of the capitalist system that we live in that is driven by profits. So shame. I think, yes, this can be blamed just not on the few individual soldiers, but on both the major parties here in Australia and across the world. And the only response that we have is to protest today and in the future for any new wars that happen.
So what do we want? Troops out. When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
Troops out!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want? War reparations. When do we want it?
Now!
Okay.
Hi everyone. We've had a lot of great speeches already, so I won't be very long. But I will start by acknowledging that, of course, we're meeting on Gadigal land today, land that was brutally stolen in 1788 and that has been a site of continual and relentless struggle ever since. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. Well, we've heard a lot in the last few days about how shocking the revelations of the Brereton report are. But I think some of us have been rather less surprised, because some of us understand, I think, what war actually means. We always understood that when Australia went in to one of the world's poorest countries, a country that had, of course, not attacked us, we always understood that people would be killed in droves. Even if it was supposedly to deny opportunities to the terrorists, we knew that more innocent people would end up getting murdered, and murdered in the thousands. And we understood this, I think, because we understand that the crime is war itself. From the moment the Afghan war was a reality, we knew that countless Afghans would lose everything: their lives, their loved ones, their lands, their livelihood, any semblance of a normal life. And it was a foregone conclusion that thousands of them would have no choice but to become refugees. And for those of them who tried to come here, they would make themselves the target of Australia's other brutal war, the war on asylum. And on the 12th of December, at 2 o'clock at Town Hall, the Refugee Action Coalition is holding a demonstration calling on the government to wind back its vicious brutality against asylum seekers in this country. Now, Australia, of course, isn't a major military power. And, you know, the political class and the media, I think, often like to focus on that. It's a sort of comfortable way, I think, to minimise our very real capacity to inflict calamity and destruction beyond our shores. The ADF might be just a minor player in the great game of international warfare. But you know, what we've learned and what we've had confirmed in the starkest possible terms since the end of last week is that in its capacity for throat slitting, for kicking people off cliffs or gunning them down while they're kneeling in a field clutching their prayer beads, the ADF has just been certified as world class. Shame indeed, shame indeed. Brereton made it clear that the conditions that allowed those sadistic executions to take place are systemic in the army, even if as a senior ADF officer himself, his report really downplays that fact. But the systemic character of that violence, again, was no surprise, I think, to most of us here. The units responsible for the outrages in the Brereton report are the same ones that flew a swastika flag on their armoured vehicle, the same ones who were formally ordered not that long ago to wear death symbols, and the same ones who blooded young recruits by having them kill Afghans. And they went undisciplined for years. More, they were decorated with the highest honours. Jim Molan, the butcher of Fallujah, a war criminal, sits in the federal Senate still. It's no wonder that this kind of action by the ADF was undisciplined and in fact rewarded. And you know, the sheer depravity of the actions of those ADF personnel that is now on the public record, I think it's hard for any normally constituted person to actually fathom, I think. I don't know whether you've watched that chilling Four Corners video in which an Australian SAS soldier executes a young Afghan crouching in the field before him. What do we hear on that 2 minutes, 12 seconds of footage? No attempt to prevent a cold-blooded slaying. No outcry of horror. Just the casual indifference of that soldier's partner to whether a human life is slaughtered in front of him or not. You know, I was very struck by this. The only moment that you actually get the sense that somebody there, apart from the Afghan, thinks that something is happening that actually matters, the only moment you get a sense that something is important is happening, is when the dog handler, in a panicked way, calls his dog off, even though he's just been completely indifferent to the life that's just been terminated before his eyes. It's a horrifying, chilling moment. Now, Brereton's report records 39 cases of murder and 2 cases of what he calls extreme cruelty or cruel treatment. And it's important to note, I think, that that's just between 2009 and 2013. How much other murder and torture didn't make it into Brereton's accountancy in the other 8.5 years of Australia's longest war? And in that context, I think it's worth noting that the riches of the English language give us a word for people who inflict gratuitous killing and torture for political reasons. And that word is quite simply terrorist. That's a term that's been conspicuously absent from official reactions to Brereton's report. But this report confirms what people in Stop the War Coalition have been saying for years and years. It's even on that calico bag that you can see some examples of around here. Australian terrorists have been on a rampage in Afghanistan. They're reported on a 5-year rampage in the Brereton report. Their rampages are much longer than that, and they're far from confined to that particular theatre of battle. And when he increased the SAS contribution to that campaign in 2007, Howard told the media that there's a lot at stake if terrorists gain a safe haven in Afghanistan. Well, you know what? The safest havens in that country, the ones that would never be attacked by any Western attack helicopter, were the ones inside the Australian Defence Force's own bases in Uruzgan province. Shame on the ADF, shame on the government. And that, isn't it? That is the warrior culture. That's the warrior culture that somehow the Australian political class in its near entirety expected to bring democracy to Afghanistan and to the world more generally. Well, what a singular demonstration we had of the Australian idea of the democracy since these allegations were first aired. We've seen journalists raided, whistleblowers prosecuted and hounded with the full might of the state, just for courageously revealing exactly what that warrior culture meant, while the criminals and the psychopaths who were responsible for it were routinely defended and indeed decorated by the highest dignitaries this country can muster. And now, of course, after the sordid details are out, we're witnessing all the obligatory expressions of horror. These are very convenient, aren't they? As part of an attempt to preserve public confidence in the army and the system that our vicious ruling class is so deeply invested in. And, you know, if we can be sure of one thing, it's that it won't be too long before this particular bloody scandal and the 39 lives lost to it are forgotten. And we move on to whatever the next mediocre Islamophobic and racist spasm is of the Australian political cycle. And we can also be sure that the minute there is an actual, God forbid, reprisal attack on Australian soil, or the rumour of one, the one thing that we can be sure of is that no part of the official blame for that will be sheeted home to the SAS. You know, less than 24 hours after the report was released, we could see the Australian media already beginning to grow a bit anxious about the anti-ADF narrative that was gaining such traction. The Australian editorialised on Friday that the report that Brereton had written had actually gone too far in criticising the warrior culture of the ADF, a culture which the Australian's editorial writer opined is vital. Further away from the far-right sewer, in the supposedly progressive media, we've heard about how the actions of quote, a few individuals will, quote, damage the legacy or, quote, tank the contribution of the tens of thousands of other Australian soldiers deployed to Afghanistan. Well, shame. Shame on the commentators and journalists who are willing to put their names to those ideas. Australia's role in Afghanistan, other people have said it here much more forcefully than me already, but it can't be repeated too often. Australia's war in Afghanistan was not some contribution to the effort to bring peace and justice to the developing world. It was a contribution to the destruction of a country and of the lives in it. It was originally promised for the benefit of Howard's re-election in 2001. And it was promised without the US even asking us, and with some elements of the US establishment being distinctly unenthusiastic about our contribution. And it was later continued for the base political advantage and the slavish US Me Tooism of our political class. Now, with the report that was released at the end of last week, politicians have finally been forced to pull their heads out of the sand. This charade, this hear no evil, see no evil charade that has surrounded the acts of Australian personnel abroad is now, in part at least, over. But I think it's really important, and perhaps for the first time I'm going to make a point that I don't think has been made yet. It's really important, I think, to note the likely consequences of Brereton's revelations, particularly in light of what he himself says about his report's purpose. So let me just quote from it briefly, and this is pretty much the last point I have to make. Brereton writes in his report, in the section that's called something like "Why This is Important," he writes this: "Moral authority," he says, "is an element of combat power. If we don't hold ourselves on the battlefield to at least the standards we expect of our adversaries, we deprive ourselves of that moral authority and that element of our combat power." Let me translate that for you. What Brereton is saying is that he sees his report as distasteful but necessary ADF housekeeping, essential to allowing the ADF to put it in the posture of the greatest combat readiness for further overseas wars. Well, I think I can speak for every one of us here in saying that we see things rather differently. You know, if we could have been bothered, we could have demonstrated outside the Commando Regiment base at Holsworthy. But we don't need to. We're outside the Defence Department here in Sydney, and we're outside the Defence Department altogether in general, because we want no part in Australia's wars overseas, whether they're fought by commandos, by the vicious butchers in the SSS, or the regular armed forces, or whether the foreigners these people killed are killed legally or not. We don't want no part of any of this. So we refuse the idea that the crimes of the SAS are anything but the start of the story. We refuse the idea that any country, Australia or anyone else, can impose peace at gunpoint anywhere in the world. And we demand not only that the SAS be disbanded, but that we divert the billions of taxpayer dollars currently lavished on war to those sectors of our society that our politicians see as far less of a priority: health, social welfare, education, reconciliation. That is expenditure that might actually make this country a better and less vicious place. Thanks to everyone for being here today.
Change